Howdy folks, back in 2005, Australian director Greg McLean brought us a highly divisive film that examined themes of isolation and survival, the real and the imagined hostility between small town folk and big city dwellers, and some of the darker aspects of human nature. At the time, most of the cast were unknown, outside Australia anyways, and prior to the film's release, the potent driving force behind this movie's success and controversy hadn't even existed yet. The film's extreme violence and graphic depictions of torture almost had it banned in the UK. And given the majority of the violence in the film is committed by a male against females, the misogyny term found its way into many a review, both then and now. If, like a lot of people, you judge this book by its Rotten Tomatoes cover, you probably wouldn't watch it in the first place, and I happen to think that would be a shame. This movie's structure doesn't break down into three traditional acts, so we're going to examine the good, the bad, and the ugly of this film in what I see as its two distinct halves. And then you'll be able to decide for yourself if you think there's something to this Wolf Creek movie, or if it's nothing more than tasteless exploitation. And I promise not to do my Australian accent at any point in this video. The movie's set in 1999, and we're following two British backpackers named Liz Hunter and Christy Earle, played by Australian actresses Cassandra McGrath and Kirsty Morassi, respectively. The girls are making their way across Australia with their new local friend Ben, played by Nathan Phillips, also Australian. Ben grabs them a burner car to get from Broome to Cairns, Queensland, along Australia's longest highway, the Great Northern. Along the way, the trio makes a routine pit stop at a gas station, which will ultimately prove to be anything but routine later on. After gassing up, they head to their final destination at the real-life Wolf Creek Crater National Park. After a few hours of holiday flirting and touristing around the breathtaking meteorite crater, they head back to the car. But the car won't start, and their watches have all stopped working as well. If I had to designate the end of the first act, I'd call it now, just after dark, when a friendly local stranger arrives in the nick of time. Fortunately for them, he's handy with engines, and seeing how utterly dire their predicament is, he offers to tow them back to his garage where he'll be able to get them back up and running. They begrudgingly accept the stranger's offer, and the man introduces himself as Mick Taylor. This first half comes to an end nearly 50 minutes into the runtime, and that gives it plenty of time to establish the fundamentals. We know the characters, we know what they're doing, and we know why they're doing it. Because director Greg McLean shows us how they interact with each other without having to tell us anything. So many modern horror movies leap straight into the jump scares without allowing us any time to connect with anybody in the film. But Wolf Creek ensures you fully get these people before anything else kicks off. Of equal importance for this film specifically, this first section immerses us in the vast expanse of the setting, which ultimately plays a vital role in the future of each of these characters. The characters doze off several times in the car, and those monotonous distances between point A and point B help us to feel the isolation of the notoriously unforgiving Australian outback. This section closes with the arrival of the helpful stranger. He's unrefined and lacking in certain social graces by the kids' standards, but given the circumstances, they have no choice but to sweep all that under the rug. I'm a huge fan of subtlety in horror, and I believe Greg McLean has snuck a grain of sinister genius in with this stranger's arrival. If you've seen the original Exorcist, you remember the beginning when Father Merrin was in Iraq? It's another subtle opening, less so in the book. He's nearly run over, he's glared at by diseased eyes, and even the dogs are fighting with each other. Father Merrin can't settle, and it all starts while they're unearthing the Pazuzu talisman, because in the presence of true evil, peace spoils. All of their watches stopped working as they got closer to this friendly stranger. Just saying. Mick Taylor tows them to an abandoned mining site a few hours to the south. Along the way, the girls try dozing off, but they can't quite manage to. If you accept my interpretation of their watches all stopping, you might agree they can't settle down any more than Father Merrin could. When they eventually arrive, Mick builds a fire and helps everyone rehydrate. He continues with his rough round the edges but genuine-sounding banter as he keeps them all captivated with matter-of-fact recollections of his savage culling of the overgrown local kangaroo and pig populations. Now, obviously, people who wrote this film off as barbaric extremism are entitled to think that, but I also think it's entirely possible they could have missed a few subtleties along the way.
One of the themes of this film is evoked during this fireside sit-down. When they all first met earlier on, Ben told Mick he was from Sydney, so Mick made the joke that is the gay capital of Australia. And coming from somebody like Mick, that's a straight-up declaration of his disdain for city dwellers and probably anybody else that's not like him. And then, during this fireside chit-chat, Ben returns the sentiment by comparing Mick to Crocodile Dundee. And you only have to look at Mick's face to know exactly how he took the dig. Now, of course, these things are subtle, but obviously director Greg McLean has thought them through. And by doing so, he's elevated the conflict by placing the raw and arduous small-town life of Mick directly in opposition to the relatively cushy, convenience store, softer existences of these young city dwellers. Now, I know a lot of people won't see things that way, but if you're able to, it might alter the way you interpret everything else that's about to happen.
When the chit-chat dries up, Mick gets to work on their car, and the trio slips into a deep sleep. And after the long day they've had in the sun, even we assume they've conked out from exhaustion. And that's when we clue in. He's switched on his unconventional charm to lure the kids into a trap. And we figure this out while the unsuspecting young tourists are unconscious and, as of yet, still unaware what's waiting for them when they wake up. It turns out, the water Mick was so generous with was drugged. Liz wakes up in a nightmare we can all relate to if you've ever had too much to drink and woken up not entirely sure of your whereabouts. The difference here being she's tied up and gagged in a shed. It takes her a full day to escape when she finally finds a shard of broken glass to split the ties. Outside the shed, her nightmare intensifies as she's realizing Mick Taylor's torn their car to bits for parts. Then she hears the unmistakable sound of her best friend being tortured in the garage.
Now, normally, this is the point in my videos where I start addressing things like rising tension and central conflicts and character developments, but this isn't that kind of movie. In this movie, we meet the characters, and then they meet Mick. Between you and I already have enough trouble with YouTube allowing faceless corporate vultures to copyright claim me illegally, without also getting done for showing you everything that makes this movie so controversial, even though I'm dying to. So if you'll indulge me a moment by fixing your gaze over this way, I will attempt to convey as much of the scene as I can using overly flowery wordsmithing.
By the time Liz is able to locate her friend, it is apparent and indisputable Mick has already defiled Christy by violating her most intimate of boundaries on multiple occasions. Shockingly, her frenzied pleading, coupled with the obvious signs of a prolonged physical battering, not only fails to deter Mick from continuing the barrage, it appears to encourage him to extend the session further with increased vigor and renewed enthusiasm. Mick's armed with a rifle and a capacious, gleaming hunting knife, and knowing how proficient he probably is with both, given his previous night's hunting stories, Liz's only option is to distract the sadistic lunatic by setting their car on fire. While he's extinguishing it, Liz runs in to try and help. She's not quite fast enough. She does get her hands on his rifle though, but like a lot of people, she's never picked one up before. And that's another example of some of the well thought out subtle realism in this film. Panicked squeeze of the trigger, she manages to graze his neck just enough to knock him out, but she doesn't know how to reload the gun to finish him off. They make their way to his truck and barely escape him firing directly at them, but their freedom is short-lived. As Mick chases after them in another vehicle, they're forced to accept they can't navigate the brutal landscape in the pitch-black night. So they ditch the vehicle in hopes he'll give up, thinking they're dead, but he keeps hunting them. So Liz convinces her hysterical, psychologically and physically destroyed friend to wait for her alone in the dark, while she runs back to get them another car. Inside one of his sheds, Liz realizes Mick's been inflicting this exact routine on a lot of other people for a very long time. And then the real horror sets in when she finds Ben's video camera, which shows Mick's truck lurking behind them at the gas station earlier that day like a specter arrived to escort them all to hell.
One more time, folks, if you don't mind.
Liz was unable to pilfer a replacement vehicle as her understandable haste inadvertently led her directly into Mick's inescapable ambuscade. Before she's able to comprehend her grave miscalculation, Mick propels his gargantuan hunting utensil through the posterior aspect of her serratus anterior between her fourth and fifth ribs, where it came to rest against her manubrium. As she clambered frantically across the cement to remove herself from the unconsensual exchange change. While taunting her, Mick detaches the tendons of Liz's flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus, subsequently separating her from 3 of her digits, all with a single vicious swipe. He then bisected her spinal cord between her 8th and 9th thoracic vertebrae, leaving her completely incapacitated and paralytic, so he can further interrogate her about her cohort's whereabouts, as he mockingly refers to her as a head on a stick. Resigned to the fact her best friend isn't coming back, Christy stumbles her way to the closest highway where a passing motorist pulls over to help the poor girl. And that's when Mick proves what we all assumed about his marksmanship. With no other options and gripped by a delirium hopefully none of us will ever experience, she shifts into the dead man's driver's seat and speeds off. When Mick pulls up next to her with more of his taunting, she's able to careen him into the ditch. But again, her elation can't outrun the speed of his expertly placed bullets. She gives it everything she's got, right up until the last minute. But in the end, it was all for nothing as she ends up stuffed into the wreck of a car and set on fire. And then back at Mick's place, Ben regains consciousness in the unimaginable pain a crucifixion would cause. He manages to free himself from the nails and heads out into the cold morning light. He's eventually overcome by the elements and a lack of water. Another pair of tourists happen upon him just in time and he's taken away to the hospital. There's a series of title cards at the end of the movie telling us the police weren't able to find any trace of Liz or Christy. Ben was kept in police custody until he was cleared of suspicion 4 months later as a result of a lack of physical evidence. The movie closes with a shot of Mick wandering off into the sunset with his gun. That suggests not so much that Mick himself got away with it, but more that there will always be this kind of danger as long as people like Mick Taylor exist in the world.
As I've said, Wolf Creek doesn't follow a traditional structure. It doesn't offer any eventual emotional payoffs or resolutions to subplots that it never introduces to in the first place. None of these characters were transformed by the story events. Although I'd suggest Ben is going to live out his remaining days as a much quieter man. He'll definitely be less capable of holding on to loose change. But in spite of all of that, I think this movie is a very effective horror. Now obviously the cast and the setting and the straightforward setup played a big role, but to me, this movie was about Mick Taylor's character and what it represents. Not just in horror movies, but in real life. I can't recall another villain so well-rounded and vicious, but believable. He's witty, he's patriotic, he's peculiar in that way that people from small isolated locations can be. And for anyone who's never been to Australia, he looks like somebody you would see every 10 minutes in the outback, doesn't he? But he's also relentless and icy, like Jaws on land. And if Jaws could drive, too, and grow amazing sideburns. And as overblown and extreme as he may have seemed in this film, there are many people like him living among us in real life. Nothing we just watched felt unrealistic or impossible. And what makes it all the sweeter, John Jarratt, the actor who plays Mick, is the loveliest guy in real life. And that makes his performance all the more commendable to me. If you've already seen Wolf Creek, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you haven't seen it, are you going to now? My next video is going to feature 10 movies from 2024 you might not have seen already, and I'm going to present the movie from right here in an extension I am building on as we speak. As always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, folks.